So let's move on now, and let's talk about the collapse of the federal government and the nation. And I added there the nation, because when the government goes into default, it's going to take all of us with it. And I'll show you why. How will it play out? You know, it doesn't take a financial genius to see that we are headed for a train wreck of historical proportions. And we know that we've got to do something about it, but we have already seen that we're probably not going to do anything about it. And I think everybody who's listening with a fair mind is probably in agreement with me. So let's talk about how this will play out. What's going to happen? The first thing that will happen is the interest rates that we pay on that debt are going to start to go up. That's the first step of the collapse. The interest rates will start to go up. Let me ask you a question. Think about this from the perspective of you as an individual. Think about you, Sammy Spender, trying to get credit. He's got a credit report. What happens when you go from, let's say you're at 800 on a credit report scale to 700 in the rates that you pay and are offered by credit cards and mortgages? They go up, don't they? And if you're dropped again to say 600, what happens? They go up. That's a law, isn't it? I mean, not a law in terms of the Congress passing it, but it's just a financial rule. I mean, all right? Why? Why do they charge you more interest when your credit score goes down? Risk. You're a greater risk. So as our financial condition gets worse, our credit rating will get worse, and we will pay higher interest rates. Did you know in 2011, S&P Global, which is one of the world's largest credit reporting agencies, they rate the credit of governments, not just like individuals, the governments. They dropped our rating from AAA to AA plus in 2011 after all the borrowing from the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009. Did you know it's still that way today? There's an article by a guy named Mark Jones. He's reporting on the S&P. S&P Global issued a statement about credit ratings that were going to be changed as a result of COVID and all the borrowing. October 16th of 2020, so just a few months back. The report said, moreover, and I'm quoting from the book here, but it contains the quote from Mark Jones about S&P. Moreover, a recent report suggests that many nations, including the United States, could have their credit ratings reduced even further because they have piled on 15 to 20 points of debt as a percentage of gross domestic product. That means that we've got a lot of debt compared to the size of our economy. Amounts that would normally take 4 or 5 years to accumulate, and locked into higher spending for the next 3 to 5 years. So S&P is coming out and foreshadowing and saying, hey, guess what? The ratings are going to go down again because you're borrowing so much money. So what happens? We went from 800 to 700, we go to 600, and our rates start to trickle up. All right? And this is where we start to see the problem. Let me start to show you the problem here. All right, remember we got that $3 trillion that we've got in income right now. $3 trillion we're taking in taxes. All right? Over the last 10 years, rates have averaged 2.5% on our debt, which is pretty good. Historically good. I'll show you in a moment that as well. Very, very low rates. At that rate, we're paying $675 billion on our interest this year. Coming up, this year we're in. That's about 23% of our income. That would be like Sammy making $100,000 and paying $23,000 in interest. That's a problem right there, isn't it? But it gets worse. All right? What happens to that number at the bottom when that interest rate at the top changes? Come on, you mathematicians, what happens? That number is going to go up. So we see credit ratings becoming a problem. Let's take it up 1%. Now we're at 904, we're almost $1 trillion in interest with a 1% increase in rates. Because the debt is so big, a small change in a rate is a monstrous amount of money. That's 32%. He's paying $32,000 in interest now. What if it goes up 2% to 4.5%? Now, there's some white hair in here, and I'm getting more white hair every day. Is 4.5% on a mortgage a pretty good rate? You better say it is. It is. In the 90s, my first mortgage was 7 3/4. So 4.5 is great. All right? So that's $1.2 trillion. That's Sammy paying $40,000 in interest. What if inflation kicks up? What's inflation? Inflation is the amount that prices rise over time as things get more expensive. What are we seeing at gas pumps right now? What happens when we get a $15 minimum wage? You think your cost of your tacos is going to go up? I've had some slides in here about inflation. I'm not going to get to them. I'm just going to show you a graph here. This is a graph that shows you the interest rates that we've paid on our debt now. In the first column here, the orange one, is in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and 2010s. In the 1970s, we averaged almost 10% on our debt. In the 80s, it was about 11. The 90s, it was 7. The 2000s, it was 4.2. Remember what 4.5 does to our 4.5% does to our debt interest problem, and then 2.5. This period right here, the 70s, 80s, and 90s. All right? What happens if inflation kicks up there? And these liberal policymakers don't realize what they're doing. They're causing all the prices to go up. And when they do that, they're causing the interest to go up. And when they do that, they're causing themselves a huge problem. They don't know what they're doing. And in the book of Job, God said, He takes away the wisdom of the chiefs of the people. He takes away the wisdom of the chiefs of the people. Do the chiefs of this people have any wisdom today? Look at this. Do the chiefs, and you know what else he says? He causes them to wander in a dark wilderness. Do you see? This is not all financial. This is spiritual. So what happens if we go back to an average here? What if rates go up to the average of the last 30 years of the 20th century? $2.6 trillion in interest on $3 trillion in income. If you get to 11, you're dead even. Everything you make is interest. Friends, we won't get there. And right now that number is about 10 because we are borrowing $3 trillion more now in total. So, interest rates start to go up. And what does this do? This creates a shortfall in the budget. In other words, the nation wants to spend on national defense. What do we spend on national defense? $800 billion probably. We spend Medicare, Social Security, education, roads and highways, right? So we still want to spend. But as the rates go up, we get into these holes where all this is going to interest. So all we have is just this shrinking amount of money to spend on Social Security and Medicare and all that. Do you see how this math works? And so we've got these shortfalls. And the government's got to try and make up that money somewhere. So where are they going to make up that money? How do we keep paying for stuff? Another terrible lie that people believe is that you can print money. Now, you can do that, but it is widely understood and historically ironclad that when you do that, you get hyperinflation. Inflation 100% and more. There are situations in the last 100 years where nations have done that, mostly third world, and they had individual notes of bills. A dollar bill, they would have $1.5 trillion bills, and you still couldn't buy a loaf of bread with it. You cannot print money. You'll be dead. So they're not going to be able to do that. So that's, all right, how are we going to make up this? We can't do that. All right? Borrow more money. You're paying $87,000 on $100,000 in interest. Who's going to loan you money? Nobody's going to loan you any money, are they? You see how we're chipping away at this to see where this is headed? Raise taxes and cut spending. We've talked about raising taxes, haven't we? We already know that doesn't work. Well, guess what you do when you cut spending? You shrink the economy. The federal government. This is what Ronald Reagan told us. The old actor. He said, don't let the government get too big. The federal government is 20% of our economy. So if the federal government cuts its spending by 10%, the economy falls 2%. The whole darn economy falls 2%. That's massive. So you can't just raise taxes. It won't work. Spending cuts slow the economy. And this is the third step. That's when the death spiral begins. Because what happens is, no matter what the government does, because the debt is so big, because the interest rates are so, and the interest payments are so big, and it's backed into a corner, and no matter what it does, it gets worse and worse and worse. There is no way out of it. Raising taxes and cutting spending results in even greater shortfall in the government's budget. And this is when the death spiral begins. Because the government can't borrow money to cover its spending needs anymore, and because its debt payments are so high, no matter what it does, things only get worse. This is why God said, don't get into this kind of debt, because it will take you down. It's already happened in history. Greece. You guys remember the Great Recession of 08 and 09? It's kind of scary, wasn't it? Well, look at what happened to Greece here. After joining the euro area, this is from a textbook actually. Well, from the Tax Foundation, and there's another one from a textbook. After joining the euro area in 2001, okay, Greece joined the euro, you know, the whole thing that Britain just left in Brexit. Greece looked fairly successful, with annual real GDP growth that averaged about 4% to 2007. In other words, their economy was growing. 4% growth of an economy is just pretty good. So everybody looked at Greece and said, man, you guys are doing great. But they were hiding stuff. But its growth was based too much on fiscal deficit spending. That's spending more than you get, okay? Fiscal is just a word that means government finances. And foreign borrowing. What have we been talking about? We're spending way too much and we're borrowing way too much. Exactly what Greece did. With the recession caused by the global financial and economic crisis, that's the Great Recession, Greece's fiscal deficit and debt rose to high levels. Ding, 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 ding. By April 2010, the Greek government effectively lost access to regular borrowing. You see? They borrowed too much, they spent too much, and then the debtors, the lenders said, we're not going to loan you any more money. And that took away all the money that they were borrowing, so they went into a hole fast. The interest rate at which the Greek government could issue new government bonds rose to prohibitively high levels. In other words, the rates went up, what I just told you. Either the Greek government had to instantly slash government spending and enact a massive tax increase, or it needed an official rescue. Do you remember what happened? Rich nations bailed them out. At some point, the U.S. government will meet the same fate. It will slowly be pushed further and further into a financial corner, having enormous spending obligations like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and Obamacare, pressuring from the right, shrinking income due to tax increases and spending cuts from the left, and massive debt payments coming up from the rear. Every month that goes by, the situation will worsen. To slow the fall, the government may attempt to negotiate better terms with its creditors, but that will only make borrowing harder and more expensive. It may also implement additional rounds of spending cuts and tax hikes, but that will only increase the budget gap. Once the spiral begins, there is no getting out of it. The only way it ends is in a total default on our debt and a total collapse of the federal government and national economy. You say, well, somebody will come along and rescue us. You know what the United States is like? The United States is like the biggest, strongest, fastest, fastest stallion God ever made. with 10 million leeches on it. Everybody's got their grip into. And every time we take a stimulus payment from the government, we become another leech, draining its life out. We are too big for anybody to rescue us. When we go down, everybody else is connected to us, everybody's going down. There won't be any way for anybody to bail us out. There won't be any money left to do it. Everybody will be out for his own good. When is it going to happen? This is from the book. So when will all this take place? There is no way to know for sure. But what history seems to suggest is that when economic failures like this do come, they happen rapidly. Mexico had a similar economic crisis in the 1980s, brought on by overborrowing and high interest rates. You see, I'm not making this up. Dornbush, Fisher, and Starts, this is a textbook I was referring to earlier, explain it this way. In the 1980s, Mexico went through a deep crisis. The country had borrowed too much in world markets, and under the pressure of high interest rates in the early 80s, found it impossible to service or pay its external debt. Borrowing abroad became impossible from one day to the next. And here's the trick. So there's another example. We have Greece, we have Mexico. Before it was all over, the result was 100% inflation, a 50% loss of currency value. In other words, their currency became less valuable, so things became more expensive for them to buy from other countries. A 30% decrease in wages, and a nearly 16% drop in the economy. We only dropped 4.3% in the Great Recession. That's 4 times as bad as the Great Recession in this situation. In commenting on the pace of Mexico's crisis, economist Rudy Dornbush noted, and this has become known as the Dornbush Law, the crisis takes much longer time coming than you think. And then it happens much faster than you would have thought. And that's sort of exactly the Mexican story. It took forever and then it took a night. What does this mean for us? It means we will simply wake up one day and our debt crisis will be all over the news. One day all will be fine. And the next day the dominoes will fall so fast our heads will spin. That's what history tells us. That's what economics tells us. So what happens when that happens? What is life like when the federal government defaults on its loans? The economy tanks. The federal government income shrinks tremendously. It can't pay Social Security. It can't pay this. It can't pay that. What is life like? In the early days of the collapse, when this happens, remember COVID. God has given us a lesson in how crazy people get because they're godless now and they're afraid. In the early days of the collapse, chaos, fueled by fear, will erupt across the country. Massive layoffs will occur, and unemployment applications will skyrocket. Initially, political leaders will promise to carry on as normal. Can you hear Nancy Pelosi saying it now? We're going to keep paying everything. We're going to take care of you. Providing Social Security, unemployment, welfare, and medical benefits as they always have. But as the money dries up, they will not be able to keep those promises. Now I'm going to pause here. And I'm just going to say it again. I'm not trying to be sensational. I'm not trying to cause you to be afraid. I'm just thinking through what people in our country would do and what would happen if the federal government, which is 20% of our economy, failed. Benefit levels will be slashed across the board, if not completely eliminated. People will struggle to find the food and supplies they require. Provisions on store shelves will quickly disappear, and looting will begin. Unable to buy what they need and unprepared individually for such a crisis, people will steal what they can find from whomever they can find it. Violent clashes will result as citizens defend their homes and businesses from mobs and thieves. Hey, we already saw it in COVID. What do you think is going to happen when the government goes under? After the initial chaos, 6 months to a year after the collapse, new challenges will manifest themselves. Soaring inflation will cause money to be increasingly useless, just like it did in Mexico. Homelessness in tent cities will abound. Food shortages will be severe, and starvation will be a real threat for many. Criminal gangs will grow in strength as cities struggle to provide a sufficient police force to maintain law and order. In a matter of months, America will take on many of the characteristics of a third world country. It is highly unlikely that America will retain its position of dominance in the world following this event. Why do you think people fear us? Todd, tell them why they fear us.
How strong we are.
And how strong are we? That military might. Hey, you mess with us, we'll put 20 aircraft carriers on your shores in a week. But what happens when we don't have any more money to pay the sailors, to fix the ships, and to send them out? In fact, nations ruled by dictators or communist governments may replace democratic countries as the most powerful nations on earth. Why? Because they can force their people to give them money. You can't do that here presently, but China can. During this time, America will be ripe for takeover by foreign powers, either peacefully or by force. If another nation or group of nations promises relief to the American people, America's political leaders, in response to the cries of citizens, may willingly pass over U.S. territory or sovereignty in exchange for assistance. Furthermore, due to the lack of funding, America's military will be greatly weakened and may not be able to repel an advance from a foreign enemy. Such a conflict may result in the first use of nuclear weapons since World War II. The collapse may also lead to a persecution of believers. Satan may be able to successfully convince the new political powers that somehow Christians are responsible for the collapse. Perhaps because they would not allow the prior socialist progressive movements in the country to take full sway. This view will not be in line with truth, of course, and reality, but that may not stop its momentum. Irrational fear and the foolish decisions it creates were shown clearly in the response to the COVID-19 outbreak of 2020. And both the Bible and history are full of examples of the godless twisting reality in order to harm God's people. My friends, do you believe for a moment that the godless Democrat liberals in this country simply just dislike us? They hate us because they hate Christ. And as Obama said, never waste a good catastrophe. If the nation is able to preserve its unity, it is also possible, I will say this, and I took this out of my notes, but I'm going to say it anyway. It's also possible that states will withdraw from the Union. Stronger states will remove themselves from the Union. And those stronger states will be rural states, states with food, with land, and not the states that have all the technology and all the banking. So you may see a shift in the structure of the states. And you know the division that we have right now. When the federal government cannot maintain the unity of the land, there may be a division within the country itself, forming more nations out of the United States than simply one. It is also possible that the government itself may become more totalitarian in an effort to keep the people paying taxes and keep the union together. This could turn us into a totalitarian state. If the nation is able to preserve its unity, resist the influence of foreign nations, and maintain a democratic form of government, however weak it may be, life eventually will settle into a new normal. In 3 to 5 years, the people in government will adjust to the changes forced upon them. The lavish lifestyle most Americans enjoyed before the collapse, however, will not continue. Life following the collapse will take on many of the aspects of Depression-era life from the 1930s. Several generations will live together in single homes. Tent cities will become a staple of the American landscape, and jobs will be in short supply. Widespread poverty will turn many to the immoral trades to which humanity has always clung: prostitution, drugs, gambling, and human trafficking. And though police forces will become more robust as local governments regain their footing, a strengthened criminal underworld will remain for years. When I started to write this book, the goal was simply to help people, Christians, understand socialism, understand why living wages were bad, and understand why profit wasn't terrible, and understand that free markets were best. But when I got to the part where I started studying the debt, and I started looking at the type of people that we have in leadership, and the way the American people are going, it scared me. Because what I realized was, this is God sharpening His sword. Where is God in all of this? That's the question. How will we survive it? And can anything good come from it? That is what we're going to talk about next Sunday. I have to leave you now at the point of uncertainty. I will simply remind you of this. The good word says, in the time of famine, the righteous will prosper. This may be a great blessing for us. And I will talk to you about why God is doing this to the nation next week, and how we can survive and even prosper through it.